So here we are at another fork in the road in the Via Papelis. We're in front of a statue that has been popularly known since the very beginning of the 16th century as Pasquino, a kind of nickname that the Romans gave to this figure, about whom they knew very little because it's so fragmentary as a sculpture. But it was also thought, from an historical point of view, that it must have represented an important Roman god, perhaps Hercules. And we'll talk about exactly why they thought Hercules and what the consequences of that were. In fact, we know that, based on other examples that we found of a similar pose, that it probably represents Menelaus with the body of Patroclus. This sculpture was discovered in the building of a palace, one that predated the one that we see here today, which is one of the grandest palaces of Rome and one of the last of the 18th century. Now, Pasquino was discovered around the time that the palace was being excavated and built by the Orsini family, the family we talked about at Monte Giordano just back the road. And here at this palace of the Orsini, we were at a fork in the road where the Via Papelis would typically bend off to the right. And discovering Pasquino, they set him up at this corner as a kind of marker, if you like. But Hercules is a god from antiquity and mythology about whom we have a particular allegory that was often important in Renaissance iconography, the choice of Hercules. Hercules, the story goes, after he made his club, with which he then goes out and performs his 12 labors, sits down to rest, and he's visited by two allegorical female figures. One represents virtue, the other represents vice. Now, we might think of vice meaning that it was a dissolute life, a wanton life, but in fact, what vice offers him is a life of ease, a life of relaxation in a shady grove. Instead, virtue points to the hard, rocky, uphill path to fame. And of course, being a great hero and eventually a god, he chooses the hard, rocky, uphill path to fame, the life of virtue. And for many popes and scholars and artists and other patrons and creators of the Renaissance and the Baroque, that allegory was something with which they could use to proclaim their own virtue. And in many gardens of the Renaissance, the forking paths that you find, the choices of paths in gardens, were often interpreted as the choice of Hercules between virtue and vice. And one would encounter different events along the way. So of course, here's another case where we're forced to make a choice. To the left, we would go into Piazza Navona, one of the great surviving open spaces of antiquity, which in antiquity had actually been a stadium. It was the Stadium of Domitian. Behind it, and off towards closer to the Via Papelis, was the Odeon of Domitian. The stadium would have been a racing track for people racing, not horse racing. A horse racing track for the ancients would have been a circus. So a stadium was a place where foot races were run. And that shape of that stadium still is preserved in the form of Piazza Navona, where the seats have essentially been replaced by buildings. The Odeon, instead, corresponds with its essentially being the shape of a Roman theater, but with a roof. Its curving shape actually corresponds to the current bend in the Via Papelis. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So here we are at a popular spot in Rome, if you like, a little bit of the comic stage mixed with the tragic stage. As the Via Papelis, it's the heroic, classical, tragic stage, but it's also a place where the comic life of Rome takes place at the same time, where ordinary people can actually proclaim their own messages, their secret messages in a way, on Pasquino, because he became known as one of the popular speaking statues of Rome. Not that he himself spoke, but the Romans would pin what they now call pasquinades to Pasquino, because he was a statue that they could treat as a kind of billboard, if you like, for their private frustrations, complaints about the papacy, complaints about the way things were run in Rome, complaints about all sorts of things. It was an opportunity for them to vent their frustrations. And so Pasquino gets these poems attached to him, and still today, now to the bollards in front of him, but historically, onto Pasquino himself were pinned these pasquinades that would complain again about things that the Romans themselves as citizens didn't like, but which they could never say publicly. And they let Pasquino say it. And interestingly, the papacy and the governors of Rome actually allowed that to happen. It was a way of a kind of tranquil, passive way of venting frustration for the Romans rather than in more violent ways. And so this kind of pressure release for the Romans was an important part of the kind of ordinary life of Roman citizens. And so Pasquino represents this interesting thing here of a kind of heroic sculpture turned into a popular figure, and he represents this moment when the Pope is going to start moving from the more popular realm of the city, the kind of somewhat darker and denser medieval core, to the somewhat grander later Renaissance center of the city to the Campidoglio and then on to the Roman Forum. So he's another kind of choice here, a choice between virtue and vice, and a choice between the kind of comic stage and the tragic stage. And we're going to start seeing grander and grander things happening as we move along the rest of the Pozzesso route. So as our famous American philosopher Yogi Berra said, when you come to the fork in the road, take it.